The key to his past was buried beneath 20 years of ash. Wrapped in velvet, hidden behind winter coats that smelled of mothballs and forgotten summers. Elias would find it on a Saturday morning, and by midnight, 3 people would be dead or dying, and the family name would become a tombstone. 13 hours earlier, the attic had seemed like nothing more than a forgotten storage space. The gray dust rose in plumes as Elias knelt on the rough plywood floor, his knees already aching against the unforgiving surface. The attic of the family estate was narrow, cramped with the debris of decades. Boxes stacked like forgotten monuments, a dress form wrapped in plastic, rolled rugs standing upright like wooden soldiers. The morning light filtered through a single circular window, cutting thick beams through the dim air, each beam filled with slowly rotating motes of dust that caught the sun like tiny planets in their own small orbit. He pulled the cardboard box from behind a stack of winter coats hung on a rolling metal rack. The coats were thick wool, the kind his mother had worn to symphony galas and charity luncheons, now faded and slightly damp. The box was heavier than he expected. His shoulders strained as he dragged it across the plywood, leaving scratches in its surface. He sat back on his heels, examining it. No label, no writing. Just plain brown cardboard, sealed with packing tape that had turned brittle with age. Elias pulled the silver pocket knife from his jeans pocket, a tool he'd carried since college, and sliced through the brown tape with a swift motion. The sound of tearing filled the small attic space. He peeled back the flaps, one corner first, then another. Inside lay layers of old manila folders, yellowed at the edges, their spines unmarked. Beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small box covered in faded blue velvet. He lifted the velvet box carefully. It was the size of a ring box, exactly. He opened it. Inside was a gold ring with a single emerald stone, and beneath it, a single Polaroid photograph. The photograph was slightly yellowed at the corners. The colors faded to something dreamlike and distant. It showed a woman laughing. His mother, Elena, though he barely recognized her this young. She was leaning against a tall man with black hair and a distinctive scar running from his temple to his jaw, a white line that cut his face like a slash. The man was wearing a leather jacket, and he had his arm around her waist. They looked happy. They looked like people who had secrets, and the secrets made them giddy. Elias held the photograph close to the circular window, letting the sunlight illuminate every detail. The man in the photo was unfamiliar. He had never seen him in any family portrait. He had never heard any mention of him in his father's stories or his mother's carefully constructed memories. The only thing that made sense was that this photograph was old, decades old, and that it had been hidden deliberately enough to survive 20 years behind winter coats no one wore anymore. He turned the photograph over. There, in blue ink, careful and deliberate, was a handwritten inscription. Our secret summer, 2004. With all my love, Julian. The name meant nothing to him. Julian. A name from a story he didn't know. A name that changed everything. The bar was called the Rusty Anchor, and it was the kind of place where local men came to disappear. The neon signs in the windows flickered irregularly. Red, red, blue, red, casting the interior in a sickly glow. The wood of the bar was scarred from decades of careless elbows and spilled drinks. The floor was sticky beneath Elias's boots. Leo was already there, occupying the same stool he seemed to have claimed as his permanent seat over the past 5 years. He was spinning a glass of amber whiskey, watching the liquid catch the light, watching it spin. His shoulders were slumped, his tie loosened. He didn't look up when Elias approached. Elias slammed the Polaroid face up on the bar next to Leo's drink. The photograph skidded across the scarred wood, leaving a thin trail of dust. Who the hell is Julian, Leo? Elias's voice came out sharp, aggressive. People at the other end of the bar glanced over, then looked away. This wasn't their business. Leo didn't look at the photograph. He took a slow sip of whiskey, his eyes fixed on his own reflection in the back bar mirror. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, weary, as if he was retrieving a fact he had been forced to memorize long ago. A ghost. You should have left the box closed, Elias. That was all. No explanation, no context. Just a ghost, and a warning too late. Elias grabbed Leo by the shoulder and spun his bar stool around. The wood creaked in protest. Leo immediately threw his hand up and brushed Elias off violently, his elbow connecting with Elias's hand. Elias shoved Leo's chest hard. Leo staggered back, his bar stool skidding across the sticky floor with a scraping sound that made heads turn. Leo threw a punch. It was fast, driven by something that had been building for years. The punch grazed Elias's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of it. Elias retaliated by tackling Leo around the waist, and they both crashed into the dartboard mounted on the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them. Darts scattered across the floor, some skidding under tables, others clattering onto wood. The bartender, a large man with a gray beard that fell to his chest, leaned over the counter and grabbed them both by their collars. He hauled them apart with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. His voice boomed across the small bar. "Take it outside." The parking lot was pounded by heavy rain. The asphalt gleamed black under the parking lot lights, reflecting them like broken mirrors. Elias leaned against his mud-splattered truck, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his wet sleeve. The rain soaked through his shirt immediately, running down his chest in cold rivulets. His eye was beginning to swell. Leo stood 5 feet away, letting the rain soak his hair, letting it stream down his face. Neither of them moved. They just stood there in the downpour, breathing hard, the sound of the rain drumming on the truck metal and the asphalt. Leo pulled a folded paper from his damp inner jacket pocket. The paper was limp from the humidity, already beginning to curl at the edges. He held it out toward Elias. His hands were trembling. Elias unfolded it carefully. It was a DNA lab report from 5 years ago. He shined his phone flashlight on the text, reading the words slowly, as if reading them slowly would change their meaning. Probability of paternity for Elias Thorne, 0%. The phone slipped from Elias's fingers. It landed in a puddle with a splash, water spraying across the asphalt. He looked at Leo, his eyes wide in the dark, and Leo's face was already draining of color. He hadn't been prepared for this question to be asked in this way, in this moment, in this parking lot. Leo's voice came out like a blade, each word precisely placed to cause maximum damage. "I'm Dad's son, Elias. You aren't. Julian is your father." Elias fell to his knees in the mud. His jeans were soaked through immediately. He grabbed the DNA report, crushing it into a wet ball in his fist, the paper collapsing into a soggy mess, the carefully printed text now illegible. The rain continued to fall. It fell on his hair, his face, his shoulders. It fell on Leo, who stood motionless in the downpour. It fell on the truck, on the parking lot, on the entire world. And nothing made sense anymore. The family law office was located in a converted brownstone on Carlisle Avenue, and the basement archives were accessed through a narrow staircase that smelled of old paper and copper piping. Elias used the crowbar from his truck to pry open a locked metal filing cabinet marked Private, Estate, in neat brass letters. The metal groaned in protest, a long, tortured sound, and then gave way. The lock mechanism shattered. He set the crowbar aside and began flipping through folders, his hands moving frantically, his breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. He found the black leather ledger tucked behind a row of estate documents. It was old, bound in leather that had cracked with age. When he opened it to the year 2010, he saw the pattern immediately. Rows of monthly payments for $2,000. Check memos. Consultancy, JM. The initials. Julian Matheson, or something else. He didn't know. But someone had been paying Julian off for years. He turned the pages slowly, watching the payments continue year after year. 10 years of silence purchased. 15. Then he found a recent entry, and his breath caught in his throat. The payment had increased to $10,000. Beside it, in his father's distinctive handwriting, a single notation: final silence payment. The date was last month. His father had died 2 months ago. He had scheduled a final payment to Julian mere weeks before his death, ensuring that the ghost would stay buried, that the secret would remain locked in the dark. A shadow fell across the page. Elias snapped the ledger shut, but it was too late. His sister Sarah stood in the basement doorway, and she was holding a pistol with a suppressor screwed onto the barrel. The gun looked professional, efficient, like an extension of her hand. Her face was perfectly composed, clinical and cold, like someone about to perform an unpleasant but necessary task. "Put the book back, Elias," she said, her voice steady and icy. "You're ruining the inheritance for the rest of us." The gun was pointed at his chest. Elias flung the heavy ledger at Sarah's head. She ducked, her reflexes sharp, and the book sailed past her, hitting the concrete wall with a thick smack. Elias sprinted past her, his shoulders slamming into hers and sending her stumbling backward. He could hear her grunt as the impact caught her off guard. Behind him, he heard the soft pop of the suppressed gun firing. A bullet sparked against one of the steam pipes that ran along the ceiling of the narrow hallway, the impact creating a bright flash and sending the pipe into violent shaking. Steam erupted from the rupture, a hissing, scalding cloud of white vapor that filled the hallway. Elias ran through it, his lungs burning, his eyes watering from the heat. He burst into the parking garage, his heart hammering in his chest. The concrete smell of the garage, the harsh fluorescent lights, the echo of his own footsteps. All of it felt surreal and immediate at the same time. He reached his truck, but Sarah caught him from behind, her fingers digging into his arm and trying to pin it behind his back. Elias swung his elbow back hard, catching her in the ribs. She gasped, her grip loosening. He shoved her against one of the concrete support pillars. The impact was heavy and hollow, the sound echoing through the empty garage. Elias jumped into the truck cabin and locked the doors. His hands were shaking as he twisted the key in the ignition. The engine caught. He gunned it, and the truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the smooth concrete floor of the garage. He peeled out, leaving Sarah standing in a cloud of exhaust and burnt rubber, leaving her behind in the dim garage with the metal pillar at her back. The lakeside cabin appeared through the trees like something from another era. It was a simple structure made of logs weathered to gray, with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked the water. The lake itself was vast and dark, reflecting the sunset in bands of orange and purple that made it look like it was burning from the inside out. Elias parked the truck 100 yards from the cabin, cutting the engine and letting it coast to a stop behind a thick stand of pine trees. He sat for a moment in the darkness of the cab, his breathing gradually slowing. He reached into the back seat and pulled out the tire iron he kept in his truck, a heavy length of black metal that could serve as a weapon if it needed to. He held it in one hand, gripping the rubberized handle and creeping toward the porch. The cabin window was dirty, the glass clouded with years of dust and pollen. But through it, Elias could see the interior clearly enough. Leo sat at a table in the main room. Opposite him was the man from the photograph. Julian, older now, his black hair turned silver gray. But the same distinctive scar still marked his jaw like a brand. He looked more dangerous at 60 than he might have looked at 40. There was something settled about his cruelty, something that had aged into certainty. On the table between them was a stack of cash. It was the kind of cash that meant an agreement, a contract, a transaction. Leo pushed a folder toward Julian. He looked calm, leaning back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. His voice came through the window, muffled but clear. The estate documents are all here. Once Elias is out of the way, we split it. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He gasped, his breath fogging the window. The understanding hit him like a physical blow. Leo wasn't protecting the family. Leo wasn't trying to shield anyone from this secret. Leo was using the affair, or what he thought was the affair, as leverage to seize the inheritance for himself. He was collaborating with this stranger, this ghost, this man named Julian, to remove Elias from the equation entirely. Inside the cabin, Julian turned and looked directly at the window. He smiled, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the lamplight. He pointed toward Elias's hiding spot, his arm extending with the certainty of a man who had always known he was being watched. "I think your brother is eavesdropping, Leo," he said, his voice gravelly and amused. The cabin door flew open. Julian moved with surprising speed for his age, grabbing Elias by the throat and dragging him inside. Elias swung the tire iron up and around, hitting Julian's shoulder with a solid thwack that reverberated through his own arms. Julian grunted and released his grip, stumbling backward. Leo moved next. He kicked Elias in the stomach, dropping him to his knees, all the breath leaving his body in one violent rush. Leo then picked up a length of heavy nylon rope from a corner chair, rope that looked like it had been prepared specifically for this purpose. Working together, Leo and Julian tied Elias to a heavy wooden chair. The rope cut into his wrists as they pulled it tight, and he could feel his hands beginning to numb as circulation was cut off. His fingers tingled. Julian stood back, rubbing his bruised shoulder and spitting on the floor of the cabin. Leo walked around to stand in front of him. When he backhanded Elias across the face, Elias's head snapped to the side, and blood spray hit the floorboards in a fine mist. His vision blurred. Pain bloomed across the entire left side of his face. "Where is the ledger, Elias?" Leo's voice was vicious, controlled. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. "It's the only thing with Dad's original signature on the payments." Elias spat blood at Leo's boots. Through the swelling that was already closing one eye, he glared at his brother, his supposed brother, though he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. His jaw hurt. Everything hurt. Julian lit a cigarette, the flame of his lighter briefly illuminating his face in the dim cabin. He blew smoke directly into Elias's face, and Elias coughed, his lungs burning. Julian pulled a small, rusted revolver from his waistband. He turned it over in his hand, examining it as if it was something precious. He leaned in close to Elias, his breath smelling of tobacco and something else, something acrid. He laughed, a dry rasping sound like branches scraping against a roof. "Your mother never loved me, boy. She hated me. She killed your father 20 years ago. The affair was the story we told to explain why he disappeared and why I was always around." Elias's face went slack. The words didn't make sense. They made sense on a factual level, the way words always made sense. But they didn't make sense in any way that mattered. He looked at Leo, Leo's face was draining of color, too. He didn't know this part. He hadn't known this part. Julian pointed the gun at Leo now. He smiled wider, enjoying the moment, savoring the power of revelation. And the DNA test? I forged that to get Leo on my side. You're both Thorne's brats, and both of you are worth more to me dead. Elias and Leo locked eyes across the cabin. The resentment that had been building between them for the past few hours collapsed into something else entirely. The shared realization that they were both targets, both disposable, both worth nothing to this man except as corpses that removed complications from his life. Julian pushed them onto the wooden slats of the pier. The lake water lapped hungrily at the pilings below, the sound of it steady and patient. The moon was high and full, casting everything in pale blue light. Julian tied cinder blocks to the ends of the ropes binding their ankles, working with methodical precision. The cinder blocks were heavy, and he had to strain to move them into position. But he did it anyway, wrapping the rope around each block multiple times, making certain it would hold. The pier extended out over the water, and the water was so dark it looked like it went down forever. That was when headlights cut through the trees. Sarah's car emerged from the forest, her headlights cutting bright paths through the darkness. She stepped out of the car without turning off the engine, the headlights casting long shadows of the pier posts across the wooden surface. Her gun was already drawn. She walked toward the pier with casual confidence, as if she was walking across her own living room. She stopped 10 feet away from Julian. She looked at him, then at her brothers with complete indifference. Her voice was bored, professional. Is it done yet? I have the notary waiting for the probate documents. Elias leaned his head back. The stars above were countless, incomprehensible. The sky was vast and cold, and indifferent to 3 people standing on a pier in the middle of the night. He understood now. This wasn't a family divided by an affair. This was something much simpler and much worse. This was a family united in greed and bloodlust. And he and Leo were the only ones who hadn't yet understood the price of membership. Elias felt the silver pocket knife in his back pocket. Julian had searched him, but not thoroughly. The blade was small, but it was sharp. He twisted his bound wrists, his fingers fumbling with the small knife, working at the angle, trying to position it correctly. The rope was thick nylon, difficult to cut, but it was old and had some give to it. Sweat dripped down his face. His shoulders screamed with tension. He felt the rope begin to fray. A strand gave way, then another. He worked the blade faster, more desperately, and suddenly his wrists were free. His hands tingled painfully as blood rushed back into them. He reached over and cut Leo's arm restraints, while Sarah and Julian argued over the stack of cash on the pier's edge, while they were distracted by the mundane details of dividing blood money. The rope fell away. Elias leaped up and tackled Julian from behind. They both tumbled off the pier into the freezing, dark water. The splash was massive, the sound of it echoing across the lake. The cold was shocking, stealing Elias's breath completely. The water was so dark he couldn't see anything, couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. On the pier, Leo lunged at Sarah. She fired, but the shot went wide as Leo slammed into her, knocking her sideways. The gun spiraled through the air and hit the water with a splash, disappearing into the darkness. Underwater, Elias and Julian grappled in the cold void. Elias couldn't see. Everything was black. His lungs were already screaming for air. Julian's hands found his throat, and Elias drove his thumb into Julian's eye with desperate force. A cloud of bubbles erupted. Julian's mouth opened in a silent underwater scream, his body convulsing. Elias pushed away from him, kicking toward where he hoped the surface was. Elias hauled himself onto the muddy shore, gasping for air that burned his lungs. The night air was cold against his wet skin, and he was shaking, his entire body racked with violent tremors. He looked back at the black water. Julian did not resurface. The lake remained still, as if it had swallowed him completely, as if the water had closed over him and forgotten he had ever been there at all. On the pier, Leo had Sarah in a headlock. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was staring blankly at the money scattered across the wooden surface. Bills that had gotten wet and were beginning to curl. Bills that would never be spent now, because the game had ended in a way no one had anticipated. Elias walked slowly onto the pier. His legs barely held him. He picked up the folder containing the estate documents and the forged DNA test. The folder was dry. Everything else had fallen into chaos, but this folder had remained pristine on the table, waiting as if it had always known that Elias would find it here. He pulled out a lighter from his jacket pocket. It was damp but still functional. He lit the corner of the documents. The flame caught, orange and bright in the darkness. He watched it burn for a moment, watched the edges curl and blacken, watched the blue ink of his father's signature turn brown and crisp. Then he dropped the burning documents into the water where Julian had sank. They floated for just a moment before the water extinguished the flames. The three siblings stood in a line on the pier. They did not look at each other. They looked at the black water. They looked at the stars. They looked at nothing. The wind came off the lake, cold and empty, carrying with it the smell of stone and ancient mud. 1 week later, Elias sat on the porch swing of the family estate. The moving van was parked in the driveway, its back door open and waiting. The morning sun was bright and merciless, illuminating every detail of the house where he had grown up. The roses were blooming beside the porch, thick rose bushes with thorns that could draw blood. He held an unopened letter in his hands. It was addressed to him in his mother's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was yellowed, and it was postmarked with a date from 5 years ago. Open only after Julian is gone. He sliced it open with his pocket knife. The same pocket knife that had cut him free from the ropes. The same pocket knife that had been with him since college. It disappeared into the green leaves and shadows, lost among the thorns and the flowers. He turned and walked toward the moving van, without looking back. His footsteps echoed on the porch boards. The engine started with a low rumble. The truck began to move, carrying with it everything he had decided to take, which was almost nothing. The driveway was long, lined with trees that had been planted decades ago and had grown tall and dark. At the end of the driveway, the truck turned toward the road. The house receded into the distance. It became smaller. It became a shape against the sky. It became something that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime, when he was still someone he no longer was.